Hello everyone, welcome to lecture number 10. Today we're going to talk about more of a background in terms of collusion. We are going to talk about more about the law behind it. We're going to talk about the activity of competition authorities and how this affects our theoretical predictions, and we're also going to talk about damage claims and pass-on. Before we start, please make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below. Okay, so let's begin. Last time we have been talking about implicit and explicit collusion. And we were, coming to the conclusion that the difference is that with explicit collusion firms communicate and that explicit collusion is illegal. And now we're going to talk more about how this is actually fixed in the law. And if we look at the European Union, then the relevant article is 101 TFEU. And here you have the text, or part of the text here, and what you can see is that basically it covers agreements between undertakings, decisions by associations of undertakings, or concerted practices. And these actions might affect the trade between member states, right? And then if you look at the problem here, then these actions basically prevent, restrict, distort competition in the internal market, right? And they bring as examples price fixing, control of production, markets, technical development or investments, or market sharing agreements, basically, right? There is, however, one difference, or one exception here, and that is 101.3. And here it is basically said that if the agreement affects the consumers in the sense that the consumers benefit, then this agreement should be seen as an exception from 101.1. And in order to understand that, we can basically look back at our example from the last lecture on mergers, so chapter G. It should be video 8. There we have been talking about foreclosure, and we're coming to the conclusion in our example that foreclosure affected competition in the sense that a rival basically was not active on the market. However, consumers benefited from it because we had eliminated double marginalization, and that would be like from a technical or from an effect perspective, that would be what is covered here. Although here we talk about cartels and not about mergers. In Germany, the relevant paragraph is paragraph 1 GBB. Here you have the German original text. In essence, the idea behind it is the same. The only difference from me as an economist's perspective is that we're not having this community dimension, but it only covers the German market, right? Which makes sense. So EU is concerned with things that affect multiple member states, and here we talk about potential agreements that potentially affect only one market, national market, Germany. Okay, so some numbers, some statistics. If you look at the homepage from the European Commission, you will see that they cover a lot of cartel, that they provide some statistics on their prosecution. And I've just taken these numbers a few hours ago, so they should be pretty accurate as of now. However, if you look at this later, you might see that the numbers change because they revise the numbers. What we're seeing here is the period 1990 to 2022, the number of decisions taking, the number of undertakings, sorry, there's an R missing, the number of undertakings and the fines imposed. What you see is that the number of decisions goes up, and we will talk about why this is. An example could be the leniency program. And we also see that the fines imposed drastically increased, with the only difference that in the last period, which is not finished yet, we don't see such a clear trend, right? In total, we have 153 decisions from 1990 to 2022. which affected 914 undertakings and a total fine of almost 30 billion euros. So quite a lot. If you look at individual firms, then, we see that the trucks case involved the highest fines here, with Daimler in 2016 being imposed a fine of over 1 billion euros, so quite a lot of money. And what we should take away from that, from my perspective, is that from the viewpoint of a firm, is that collusion can be quite expensive, right? And it's not only illegal, but also very costly in the end. And that's only one part of the picture, because we only talk about fines, right? So we have not yet talked about any private litigation, which we will address later, right? Okay, so let us now get more into the work of competition authorities. Competition authorities detect cartels by their communication, right? So the emails they write to each other, witnesses or protocols that were made, this is the smoking gun in these cartel cases, right? And the competition authorities can detect this evidence with audits or complaints of consumers, and a special case is the leniency program, which we will analyze in a second, which basically works by giving the firms an incentive to self-report. But before we analyze leniency, we will first analyze what happens if you assume that there is a competition authority that basically screens the market and detects a cartel agreement with a probability rho. And if it detects the cartel agreement, then imposes a fine, capital F, right? So your expected fine would be rho F, right? So as a risk-neutral firm, that's what we will assume in the following, you would have to take into account an expected fine of rho F when you collude. And what we're going to look at from a model perspective, should work better. What we look at from a model perspective is the paper of Obeire and Kovacic from 2006 in IJAO. And they basically take a model of implicit collusion and assume that collusion is fined, right? How does this look like? Well, two things change in terms of the per period profits, and that is the cartel profits and the deviation profits, right? The competitive profits are not affected because competition is not illegal, right? So what happens is that in periods when the cartel is active, the firms just have to take into account their expected fines. So your expected profits in the period where the cartel is active is your deterministic pi k, there's no uncertainty involved in here, minus your expected fine rho F, right? So that has to be taken into account. And similarly, the same applies in the period of deviation. You get as an expected deviation profit your profits here, but you have to subtract your expected fine, right? So that's the expected payoff when you deviate is the profit that you get minus the expected fine that you have to pay, right? And if you translate that into our present value notation, then all you have to do is to replace our old pi k and pi d with the new terms pi k minus rho f and pi d minus rho f, and you get to this term here, right? So your per period payoffs when you collude is pi k minus rho f, and your per period payoff when you deviate is pi d minus rho f, right? And you see here the difference that your long run loss is deflated pretty tough by this rho f in every period, and your deviation profit is also deflated by the expected fine. Now, as we have done last time, we will do here. We want to calculate a critical discount factor, and that critical discount factor results from using VK and VD, and what we were claiming last time is that the cartel is stable whenever VK is at least as high as VD. And all we have to do is then to solve this inequality, and then we get to that critical discount factor, right? And if we do that, then we get to this expression here. So just take these two and probably set this equal to one another and solve it with respect to delta, and you will get to this term. And what we will do is to compare this term here to our old critical discount factor when there was no competition authority, and that was this one, right? So we have determined that in the last lecture. So all we have to do is to compare these two terms, and it comes immediately clear that this term here is larger. Why? Just look at the terms here. The denominators are basically the same, but they are the same. But the denominator is lower with a competition authority because you subtract minus rho f here. That means that the entire term is larger. So our critical discount factor with a competition authority is higher than the critical discount factor without a competition authority. In other words, your fines deter collusion. And that's pretty straightforward from an economic perspective, even though there's a slight effect that could turn this around, because you have to take into account that your deviation profits are deflated by rho f, which makes deviation less profitable, but your long run loss is also deflated by the same term, or basically your per period profits in the long run are deflated by the same term, and that overcompensates this lower incentive to deviate, in a sense that the cartel is destabilized if you include fines here. And we can visualize this pretty easily by noting that our discount factor ranges from 0 to 1, and our critical discount factor lies, for example, here. And we have just seen that the critical discount factor with a competition authority is higher, so let it, for instance, be here. So the exponent CA stands for competition authority. And if you think about this, then you know that all cartels, that the cartel forms or is stable whenever the discount factor exceeds the critical discount factor. So if we don't have a competition authority, this is the range of discount factor that support a stable cartel. Whereas if we have a competition authority, this range is smaller, and this is only this part here. Why is that? It should be green. Yeah. Now, so this is the range of collusion supportable critical discount factors with a competition authority. This is without a competition authority, so you see that the range is smaller. So we argue that there is deterrence with a competition authority. And we can even dig a little bit deeper here from an intuition perspective or interpretation perspective. In this range here, from 0 to delta crit, all the discount factors are below the critical discount factor. So these are the cartels that won't form even without a competition authority. So here the competition authority doesn't do anything. And for all discount factors above the critical discount factor with a competition authority, cartels will form even though the competition authority is active. So here the competition authority also doesn't do anything. But here in this range, so in the range delta crit to delta crit with a competition authority here, we have the competition authority deterring cartels that would form if there was no competition authority. So here is basically the effect of the competition authority vis-a-vis the expected fines on the stable cartels. Just as a small technical aside, we have here a closed interval and here an open interval due to our tie-breaking rule that said that whenever the actual discount factor is equal to the critical discount factor, we assume that the firms collude, even though at that point it's undeterminate because they are indifferent between collusion and deviation. So that's just an assumption, basically. But that's not a strong assumption, because It's just a single point, which shouldn't be relevant in that interval anyway. Okay. So now let's talk about the leniency program. It was installed in the European Union in 2002. It was installed in the US earlier than that. And the idea behind is that the firms can self-report their cartel activity, and that self-reporting leads to a reduction in fines, and even full immunity is possible. Full immunity is usually granted to the first firm reporting the cartel activity, whereas those who come later and cooperate with the competition authority can get partial reductions in fines. And we have empirical evidence that the leniency program actually improved cartel deterrence, and that's the article of Miller here, 2009 AER, that you can look at. And that basically corroborates that leniency program is effective, even though from a theory perspective, and that's what I'm going to show you in the next slides, the effect is less clear, right? So because the thing is that in theory, the deterrent effect of fines could be reduced if we get a reduction in fines. The other thing is that, and that's currently discussed, for instance, in Germany, that damage claims can reduce the firm's incentive to apply for leniency, because if they apply for leniency, they get a reduction in fines, but they don't necessarily, do not get a reduction in private litigation. So that reduces the incentive to self-report. Okay, so how can we formalize the leniency program? Well, we just assume that when a firm applies for leniency, it also deviates from the cartel agreement. Because if you deviate, the cartel will end anyway, and that means that you can also deviate, if you apply for leniency, then the cartel will not be there tomorrow, and you could also deviate and take the profit with you, right? So we assume that in case you deviate, you get the deviation profit, plus you benefit from a reduced fine small f, and that reduced fine is smaller than the fine that would be imposed if you were detected, right? So it's smaller than the actual fine, capital F. And if we formalize that, nothing happens to our present value in a cartel, because there you don't apply for leniency, but what is affected is our deviation present value, where in the period of deviation you subtract small f, whereas if we didn't have the leniency program, we had our expected fine here, right? So this is basically what changes. And if we compute the critical discount factor here by setting this one equal to this one here, then we end up with this term, right? And when we compare this term here, so the term with a competition authority but without a leniency program, with this term, critical discount factor with a leniency program, the results are not clear per se. And what we see is that the leniency program improves deterrence if and only if the critical discount factor with a leniency program exceeds the critical discount factor without a leniency program. And this is the case when the reduced fine is lower than the expected fine rho f. We can visualize that. So what we have here is a plot of the critical discount factor with a competition authority but without a leniency program, and the critical discount factor with a leniency program for a deviation profit of 144, cartel profit 72, competitive profit 0, and a reduced fine of 30. And what you see is that in the range from 0 to 30, here on the horizontal axis is the expected fine rho f, and when the expected fine rho f is between 0 and 30, so below the critical discount factor, below the reduced fine, then this equality does not hold, and you see that the critical discount factor with a competition authority but without a leniency program is higher, right? Here, this one is higher, so here the leniency program is actually weakening the deterrent effect so it's better to not have a leniency program here. Whereas if the reduced fine or if the expected fine increases, then we have a situation where the leniency program now has a more deterrent effect, because then the reduced fine is lower than the expected fine, right? So that's what we can see. So in theory, the effect is ambiguous, but we see that the practical application appears to be effective, at least in the paper of Miller with the data for the US. Okay, so now we're talking a little bit about the facilitating factors for collusion. So what makes collusion more stable? And we do this based on Motta, even though there's a lot of authors and ideas here on that. And what we're going to look at is the incentive constraint, which we have been talking about in the last lecture, the short-run gain from deviation, and the long-run loss from that deviation. And we know that collusion is stable when that short-run gain is lower than the long-run loss. And we know that collusion is stabilized if the short-run gain decreases, if the per-period loss increases, so you get more, your punishment is more severe, and if you become more patient, because then you put more emphasis on the long-run loss, right? So everything that decreases the short-run gain, increases the long-run loss, or affects the patience will stabilize collusion. The first factor that we're looking at is concentration, right? So if you have more firms in the market, your share of the monopoly profits as one of the cartelists is smaller, right? So if N is the number of firms and the number of firms go up, your share of the pie will decrease, and that makes cartels less attractive, or collusion less attractive. Also, your profits from deviation become relatively large compared to the punishment. Why is that? Well, look at the Bertrand example. If you have like 100 firms in the market and you get in every period only this pi m over n, and if you deviate, you get the entire monopoly profit. That makes a deviation relatively attractive. So concentration, less firms in the market, should make collusion more attractive. Entry barriers. We know that collusion raises industry profits, and that attracts entry or entrance. And if there is entry, then this entry destabilizes a cartel because it brings with it competition into the market. So what could you do? You could potentially integrate the entrant, but it would be best if the entrant wouldn't be there. And when does entry not happen? Well, if there are entry barriers. So entry barriers also make collusion more stable, or should we expect that? Links between firms, right? So you could have contact between employees or management, right? So that could be sociological or psychological factors. If people know each other well, they are more likely to cooperate, I think. So that would facilitate collusion as well. And another thing is cross-ownership. You know that if you deviate from a cartel agreement, the other firm is fooled, and that reduces that other firm's profit. But if you have shares from that other firm, you are harmed as well if you fool them, right? And therefore, cross-ownership can stabilize collusion because it partially internalizes the punishment. The harm that you impose on the other firm if you deviate from a cartel agreement. Frequency of orders. If you have infrequent or large orders, your incentive to deviate is higher. Why? Well, if you sell, for instance, planes only once per year, and you deviate from a cartel agreement, then you get a large chunk of that profit from that profit, right? And if you have more frequent orders, then it's easier to punish the rival, right? Because if you have only one order a year, you have to wait for 1 year in order to punish the deviator, right? So the more frequent the orders, the more stable we expect collusion to be. What about buyer power? Well, if we talk about a B2B context, then in reality we usually have, well, it depends on the case of course, but we oftentimes have bargaining between the firms, so the sellers and the buyers, right? And if they bargain, then what affects the bargaining outcome is, depending on the theory that you apply, but usually if you, for instance, consider a cooperative bargaining problem, then it's the disagreement profits that play a role. And we basically have the idea that buyers with a better disagreement profits, they, ceteris paribus, enjoy buyer power. And what affects these disagreement profits could, for instance, be that the buyer can simply threaten to buy from a potential entrant or from a cartel outsider. And that would basically limit the cartel's ability to exert to impose an overcharge, and that would make the cartel less attractive in the first place. The buyer might also produce its own good and could threaten to just produce on its own, and that would also reduce the overcharge. Note that it might reduce the overcharge, but it doesn't necessarily completely eliminate the incentive to collude, but it definitely might decrease it. We could also combine, as a buyer, combine multiple orders to destabilize the cartel, as we have just been talking about in terms of frequency of orders. And that could also be, if we have an auction to run, then we could design an auction that is collusion proof, right? So there's a lot of literature on that, and yeah, it works. So there's a lot of literature on that I'm not going to cover here, but in reality, firms place a high emphasis on, if they, or even the government places a high emphasis on designing auctions that are not prone to collusion. Okay, so next thing, evolution of demand, right? So in reality, it could be that demand fluctuates and it is uncertain, or is uncertain. And this uncertainty could, for instance, be an IID shock, which is an unforeseen event, like, unfortunately, a war or a pandemic, and that affects the demand. And basically, what we see is that when we have a positive shock here, then we have the same as with the frequency of orders. So we have an incentive to deviate now, because tomorrow we can get a high deviation profit now because demand is high, and in the next period demand will be probably lower again, so punishment will not be harsh. Cyclical demand, right? So it could be that we have some of these cycles, sometimes demand increases and then it starts to decrease again, and if we go from there, then collusion is more stable in times of increasing demand. Why? If you think about increasing demand, this might, ceteris paribus, increase your profits, and if you deviate here, then you get a relatively small profit from deviation, and your long-run loss falls into the period where demand is higher, so your punishment will be harsher, right? And vice versa, if you are in a decline in demand and you deviate here, you get a relatively high deviation profit, whereas your long-run loss falls in a period where demand is smaller than today, right? So a cartel should be more stable in periods of increasing demand and less stable in times of decreasing demand, right? So we could expect something like an on-off cartel. That's possible here, right? In general, we can say that the more shocks we have in the market, the less stable a cartel is, right? Because when multiple things happen at once, you don't know whether somebody deviated or whether it's the market that goes out of hand here, right? So that might destabilize a cartel. When we talk about the homogeneity of products, or sellers, the effect is ambiguous, right? So we know that if we have more differentiated products, then the profits from deviation should be lower. Why? You deviate and you don't attract a lot of so much market share as with homogeneous products, right? However, by the same token, the effectiveness of punishment also goes down, right? And that destabilizes collusion, right? So you have a stabilizing effect and a destabilizing effect at the same time. right? So with regards to differentiated products, I would advise you to look at Georg's lecture on industrial organization. There we talk about a lot about that, and the essence is that basically with differentiated products you can increase your profits because it weakens competition, right? And we have been talking about that in the context of vertical mergers also. Okay, what about symmetry and capacities? Well, we can say that if capacities are not fully utilized, it is that the firms with high capacities and high unutilized capacity have a higher incentive to deviate. Why? We know that basically if capacity is unutilized, you could produce more, thereby reduce your average costs, and that would increase your profits, right? So you have a stronger incentive to deviate the more unused capacity you have. Moreover, firms with lower capacities have a limited ability to punish, right? So if a large firm deviates and the small firm only has small capacities, then it has little means to increase production and thereby punish the deviating large firm. However, if you look at the literature, the effect of capacities on cartel stability is not absolutely clear. Okay. What about multi-market contact? Think about two markets A and B, right? If you deviate in one market, then you could be punished in two markets, right? However, if you deviate, you could also deviate in multiple markets, right? And that could increase your incentive to deviate. So here the effect is also unclear. And that also affects market allocation schemes, where you basically have one firm covering market A, the other firm covering market B, and in a deviation in that case could look like the firm that is supposed to cover market A enters market B. Right? It could be considered a deviation. And how could firm B react? Well, it could enter market A. But that's something that can be, that there's also literature on that, and there's also cases on that. Okay, in general, there's caveats to applying this facilitating factors in practice. And I'm thinking about the Garrett Olczak paper 2018 in IJO. There's other papers on that, but here it's absolutely clear. The idea is that, or the problem is that, facilitating factors do not distinguish between tacit and explicit collusion. Pretty clear that they don't do, because we have not yet any accepted theory of explicit versus tacit collusion. And the problem is that explicit collusion is illegal. So if you say, you have, for instance, you have a cartel, a detected cartel, and you say, okay, it's pretty clear that the cartel has generated harm to the consumers because you have a few firms and so on and so forth, right? So the market conditions facilitate collusion. Then you are basically running into a fallacy, because if the market conditions facilitate collusion, tacit collusion, and explicit collusion is illegal, then why do we see explicit collusion, right? If the firms would be rational and they know that explicit collusion is illegal, then why didn't they collude tacitly, right? And that raises the question what the actual counterfactual scenario is. So what would happen if the firms didn't collude? That's an open question. Okay, so now let us briefly talk about damage claims and pass on. It's clear that, or that's basically what we have talked about in the last lectures, that collusion raises prices, and increase in prices harms consumers. And as explicit collusion is illegal, consumers can claim damages from the cartelists, right? Private litigation. And the challenge here is that the claimants have to show that a damage occurred, and they have to quantify that damage. And the basic idea in that quantification process is that they want to identify an overcharge, which we have here formalized as a percentage overcharge kappa, which is just the percentage difference between the cartel price and the competitive price. The problem is, it looks pretty easy in theory and straightforward and everything, but in reality, all you see is PK. You have no idea what PC is, right? Because that's not what you see. You don't see that in reality. That is the price that would have occurred had the firms not colluded. And that's called the counterfactual price, or the price in the counterfactual scenario. So the price that we do not observe that, but would expect if the cartel hasn't been there, right? And to compute this price, we have several methods, right? And we can use that, and we can solve that econometrically or theory-based. And if we apply econometric methods, we could, for instance, use a panel or time series analysis where we have a period during the cartel and before or after the cartel. And we apply a time series analysis here, a panel analysis, where we just include a dummy that is 0 if we don't have a cartel, and this is 1 when we are in the cartel. And all we do is to take the coefficient of the dummy and interpret this coefficient as the cartel overcharge. The problem with this type of analysis is that we have to control for many different factors, right? There's much more happening than just cartels in reality, and if we don't take into account these factors in terms of control variables in our estimations, then our estimation of the cartel coefficient is basically useless, right? So in reality, it could be pretty tough to apply that one. And we have other methods, such as the difference in differences approach, where we just use a different market as a comparison. That could be a geographic market or another product market. And what we do is basically use a technique which is called difference in differences, that stems from basically also the idea that we have in pharmaceutical trials, where we just say that we have one group that is treated with the actual pharmaceutical, and we have a control group that is not treated with the pharmaceutical, and analyzing the difference between the two groups allows us to identify the effect of the treatment. Here the treatment would be the cartel, and the control would be the market without the cartel, right? And we would want to identify the cartel effect by comparing the two groups. That is basically what is currently considered the best method to identify cartel overcharge. On the other hand, of course, these econometric methods are pretty data intense, especially a difference in difference, because you need to have a control group, right? So you need to have data on that control group. What you could also do is to take a theory-based approach if there's, for instance, no control groups available, or because your time series analysis is too inaccurate, whatever. You could use a theory-based simulation where you basically say, okay, I take my model and make it so realistic that I can basically simulate the entire market and simulate what would have happened without the cartel. That method is also pretty tough, as you know that our models that we apply in economic theory are just models, right? So they are simplified versions of reality. And here we want to have not a simplified version, we want a version of reality, basically. And that could also be relatively tough. In these damage calculations, there's 3 things that we have to take into account, or that you will encounter in the practice here. One is Damnom emergence, that is the so-called lost profit. For all units that a buyer has purchased, the buyer has paid a price PK, but should have paid, without the cartel, should have paid a price PC. So for all these bought units, they have incurred a loss of PK minus PC, right? And that's the Damnom emergence. The other thing is lucrum cessans, and that's the quantity or volume effect, right? So had the buyer not purchased the good at a high cartel price, but at a lower competitive price, he would have purchased more, right? And this volume effect should also play a role. The last point is interest, right? So in reality, we usually have a situation where cartels are detected years later, and the damage claims covers a long period of time in the past. And due to that, we have to take into account the interest rate payments on these 2 effects here. Okay, so now let's finally talk about pass-on. In reality, collusion often affects intermediate products. So products that are purchased by other businesses, firms that use these products to buy or to produce their own products, which they eventually sell at some point to final consumers. If you look at the examples, the overview of cartel cases from the European Commission, I've just written down some examples here. So graphite electrodes, rail tracks, elevators, trucks, car glass, methionine, animal feeding, phosphates, lysine, zinc, steel. There's only a few final consumers who actually purchase on a large scale elevators, for instance, or trucks, right? So as a private person, you usually don't buy a truck. That's something that you only buy when you are a firm, or steel beams, right? So not many of us have a lot of steel beams lying around at their apartments, although that might be relevant when you buy a house. But anyway, this is something that usually that these products are usually purchased by other producers along the value chain, right? And depending on the good and the mode of competition, the buyer, the direct buyer, can pass on the overcharge to the consumers or to the indirect buyer. Don't call that consumer, because it's not necessarily the final consumer. Let me call that indirect buyer, and that is the direct buyer. Right? So just the wording should be correct. So the direct buyer might pass on the overcharge to the indirect buyer, and that would be the pass on. And the defendants, so the ones that are sued, could use this passing on defense to attack the buyer's claim. And the idea would be that the cartelist argues that the direct buyer actually passed on the damage or the overcharge to the indirect buyer, so the direct buyer would not be the valid claimant, right? And if that could be the pass-on could be complete or partial, right? And depending on that, it could be the entire claim that is invalid, right? Or that the defendant would argue would be invalid, right? And that's what you have to do. That's something that could be applied. Just to illustrate this example, we assume that there's collusion that affects a variable input factor of direct buyers, and that increases their marginal cost from C to C prime. The direct buyers are in perfect competition, and the demand function is perfectly, or the inverse demand function is perfectly inelastic, so vertical inverse demand, and that leads to a situation where we have a 100% pass on. Why? Because price equals marginal cost, and that would be the price without the cartel. That would be the price of the indirect buyer that the indirect buyer pays with the cartel. So the entire cartel damage or overcharge is passed on to the indirect buyer, right? We have no quantity effects here because demand is inelastic, and that would lead to a situation of perfect pass on. So here the argument, the passing on defense would be valid. And if we look at this from a long run perspective, then this pass on defense would be even valid if this collusion would have affected a fixed input factor, right? Because we know in the long run, in perfect competition, we have price equals average costs. Okay, so finally, I have promised you in the last lecture that we look at finite and infinite geometric series. I'm going to go through that briefly. The idea was that we have a geometric series of the form that our present value is equal to our period 0 profits plus discounted tomorrow profits plus twice discounted day after tomorrow profits, and so on and so forth, until to a final period capital T, right? So how can we write this down easily or more easily? The idea is to multiply that equation by the discount factor delta, and what we see is that this expression looks slightly different from what we had before, and this will prove helpful if we just subtract delta VC from VC, because there we see that this term and this term are the same. So all these terms will drop out, and the only thing that we're left with is pi c minus delta to the power of t plus 1 times pi c. And if we factor that out, then we are left with this term. Right, so we know that 1 minus delta Vc minus delta Vc, just factored out the Vc here, is 1 minus delta t plus 1 times pi c, right? So again, pi c factored out, and you can divide by 1 minus delta to get to this expression here. And we have just assumed in the last lecture when we derived the infinite geometric series that t approaches infinity, and if t approaches infinity, then delta to the power of basically infinity, and delta is between 0 and 1, will basically vanish, and all we're left with is 1 over 1 minus delta times pi c. Right? And we had used that for a starting date of t equals 1, of t equals 0, but we also had that for a starting period of t equals 1. Why? When we were talking about the deviation present value, then the expression looked like this. So what we want to do is to isolate this one here, and that's what we call v prime c. We repeat the same process, multiply by delta, subtract this one from this one, rearrange, and we get to this term here. And then if we look at the super game, we assume that t approaches infinity. We see that this term here disappears, and we are left with the terms that we have just seen in the last lecture. Okay. Lastly, I also promised you a derivation of the critical discount factor. Here we have not assumed anything like a competition authority, so no leniency program. This is just a blueprint on how you can determine the critical discount factor, just for you to have a solution here. That's all I wanted to tell you today. Thank you for your attention. Please like the video if you liked it. You can leave comments below if you have questions or if you want to discuss something, and we would also be appreciated if you subscribe to our channel. See you in the next one.